Okay, folks. Hi, my name is John Wyerth. I'm a physical therapist, and I do bike fittings for a living. This is my studio here where I work. Um, and today we're going to go over really five really simple things that you can do to hopefully make your bike saddle feel better. This is something that I run into a lot with my clients, um, and it is often just really simple things, and it's often the fixes are not generally what people think. So I'm going to start, we're going to jump right in here to just a simple, oh, let's go back here, stop that. And sorry about this, let me reset my, okay, now I think we're ready to share that. Okay, we should be in good shape. You should be seeing the 5 bike fit mistakes you can change for a ride all day saddle. So there are just 5 that we're going to go through today, but really there are dozens of these that we could go over. I just tried to pick the 5 I think that are most pertinent for people and will give you really the most bang for your buck. The first one we're going to go over is that your saddle is positioned nose down. This is something I see a lot of. People often feel like if they tip the nose down and it'll take pressure off of the soft tissues that they're sitting on, in the perineum and everything. And this is true, but this is also, it's a trick. This is short-term saddle relief. It creates other problems. For instance, it will cause you to slide forward constantly on the saddle when it's tipped down like that. You slide forward, you have to scoot back. You slide forward, you have to scoot back. You have to keep on doing that over and over again. And this does a number of things. One is it does put more weight on your hands because now you don't have a stable position that your pelvis is working from. But what also happens is it does create more shear force. There's, this anterior translation, you might say, on the soft tissue while you're bearing weight on it creates a shearing force or creates some friction. What also happens is you end up sitting on the narrower part of the saddle. This narrower portion, just because we end up slipping forward, and this narrow portion obviously is not where we're meant to sit. So what can you do about it? Really simply, a lot of these tips are pretty basic, but the first thing you do is level your saddle. Pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory. Set the bike on the ground, make sure it's on level ground, and just take a look at it. You can even set it, if you want to set an actual bubble level or use your iPhone, something like that that has a level app on there, that's fine. One thing I would do though is just to make sure that it's level when you sit on it. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, so on our saddle, they actually, of course, we have these rails on here. The rails actually, what they do is act like little leaf springs so that the saddle itself can flex and bend as we pedal. It can move underneath us just a little bit. If you set your saddle level, there are certain cases where when you sit on it, it might not be level anymore. It actually might nose up, it might nose down, depending on the saddle. Some are more flexible than others. Some of the hollow rail, especially the titanium rails I found, some of them tend to move a little bit more, which isn't a bad thing. It just needs to be accounted for. Also, what will matter is where you're clamped on the saddle rails. So in this one, we have a Thompson C-post, and it's pretty wide clamp, so it stabilizes quite a lot. But with these short rails, it's clamped pretty much in the middle. But if you have your saddle pushed all the way back, so that the clamp is to the front of the rails here, or the opposite of that, all the way forward. Maybe you're trying to make up for a reach deficit on the bike. The saddle will act differently because now there's basically, when you clamp to one side, it kind of locks that side of the rails out a little bit more and you get more movement out of the other side. So you do need to be careful and make sure it's level when you're sitting on it. Additionally, you might need to lower your saddle a little bit when you first do this. Generally, when people nose their saddle down, they notice that it allows them a slightly higher saddle position. And this is because, again, one, the pelvis is slipping forward on the saddle, and it also allows the pelvis to roll forward, to actually tilt anteriorly, which kind of brings the hip sockets closer to your feet effectively. And so when we level it, it kind of stabilizes the pelvis for one, but it also rotates it back slightly to whatever your stable pelvic posture is. And it actually it might make it necessary, like I said, to lower that saddle just a few millimeters. So the next issue that I see quite a bit of is people have the wrong cleat position. And the most common way is when this cleat position is, the cleats are too far forward, as they are in this picture here. This does a number of things. One, it can cause you to toe down during your pedal stroke, which in and of itself isn't bad. I mean, there are positions throughout the pedal stroke where we do toe down more than others, but we don't want it necessarily as a default position. We really need to bear weight through our feet through the pedal cycle. And when we're toeing down, one, it kind of jams the foot into the front of the shoe a little bit more, and we end up getting more forefoot pressure. And so if you do have, numbness or tingling in your feet or toes, this might be one of the causes. But we really need to make sure our feet are grounded and so having the cleats a little further back will often help this out. As far as rotation goes, we could go into that quite a bit. These days, many people don't have as many rotational restrictions, just because the pedals and the cleats allow for an adequate amount most of the time. There are situations where we need to do some tricky things, like if we need to wedge a cleat or shim a cleat, something like that. But for the most part, just making sure that cleat is a little further back, and effectively what we're doing is shortening that lever arm between the ankle joint and this cleat where it's pressing through the pedal. So, so tips: pull the cleats back a little bit if you want to test this out. You can start, it's a good idea always when you're making any changes to start small, but there's usually much less downside to being a little too far back as too far forward. Some cyclists might find it awkward to have the cleats all the way back, and that's fine. Usually, if it's a big change, like for these cleats, pulling these all the way back would be a fairly significant change. And it's definitely, I think, most of the time something that's going to be noticeable. And it will take some time, certainly, for your body to get used to this new position and essentially develop a new motor plan for it. So again, if you want to, you can start small and just pull the cleats back a little bit. You will need to lower your saddle a little bit when we do this, though, because effectively what we're doing when we pull the cleat back is we're making your leg shorter. Generally, about 5 to 7 millimeters of saddle height is enough to do the trick. If you're changing a lot, you might need to, do a little bit, a few millimeters more than that. Sometimes you can get away with less than that, though. So the third thing is, I think, the least important of the 5, and this is having the wrong saddle. There are lots of different saddles out there. But in my experience, about 80% of the time, it is not the saddle. Switching saddles helps a lot less often than you would think. Generally, all these other factors that we're discussing today play a much larger role. But that, generally, but often what happens is I'll have people come in for bike fits, and they've been having saddle troubles, and they are already on the hunt for a new saddle, or they've already bought a new saddle or a couple of new saddles. I've had a few people spend hundreds of dollars on 5 and 6 new saddles, trying to test them out to try and find the one. And then we do a bike fit, and they realize that actually all the saddles, none was really drastically better than the other. It was just the fit that was off. So in there really are just tons of options in this area. We have what I would call, more traditional shape saddles like this Sella Italia up here. And what's, becoming more popular are some of the split nose saddles like this ISM. But there's so many options. What I would do is I would probably, though, my first tip would be to just start with the traditional saddle. Why would I do this? Primarily because these split nose saddles, they can be fantastic. They can work really well. I've had clients that have struggled to find any sort of comfort on their saddle, and then we get them on one of these and get it positioned properly, and it has been the only thing that's helped their issues. And so they can be great, but there's two caveats about these. They set up a lot differently than a traditional saddle. On this traditional saddle up here, you would a lot of times you'd expect your pelvis, what you're bearing weight on, to rest somewhere back here, right? And then so with your glute soft tissue and everything, you're covering this whole saddle. On these, you don't sit on them towards the back here. Your sitting pressure goes much further up onto these rails, and so the back third of this saddle should be completely exposed, and should not be sat on by the rider. So if it's covered, then you're not sitting in the right place. So they are a little trickier to set up. They're also a bit more specific, I would call it. Some people might call it finicky, but once you figure out the foibles, they actually can work really well. But with these saddles, you will find often one or two really good places to sit on it. Minor variations in where you're contacting the saddle. Where with a traditional saddle like this up here, you actually sometimes can get away with 3 or 4 slightly different positions through this seating area here. 4 might be pushing it sometimes, but there certainly is a lot more mobility, I think, on some of these, where the split nose down here, these like the ISM or the Cobbs, in my experience, they are, again, much more specific. And so they have generally 1 or 2 little spots that you'll feel really good on. My next tip is fix as much of the rest of this list as you can before you start investigating new saddles. Like I said, there are many instances where the saddle is just not the answer. A new saddle isn't. And when you go to try other saddles, when you go to that point, try a bunch of them and do not buy them. There are many situations now. Many bike shops offer this. A lot of fit studios offer this, where you can demo saddles. Here at my studio, I allow clients to just take a saddle out. They just check them out, and they can just go ride them for a week or 2 and see how they are. I adjust them for them to make sure it's set up in the right spot. And then all I ask is that if it's a saddle you're going to buy, just buy it from me. That's some places will charge you a rental fee, and then if you end up buying a saddle from them, they just subtract the rental fee from the saddle, and I think that's appropriate too. But definitely do not go out and buy saddles, because it gets expensive very quick. So number 4, this is I think one of the simplest solutions is you sit too much. If you want your rear end to feel better, the best thing you could do is to get up off it and let it breathe a little bit. Again, I have a lot of clients that have been having fit issues. Obviously, that's where they're coming to see me, and I think this stems from many of them not being fit appropriately on their bike, and so they don't feel balanced. They don't feel comfortable on it, and so standing up is a challenge. They actually don't feel as stable when they stand up. But standing, even for a few seconds, increases blood perfusion to the soft tissues, or allows blood to flow to the soft tissues. And we can't forget that the nerves as well, they basically need perfusion of blood as well. So it's, if we are depriving the nerves of normal blood flow, you're going to get nerve symptoms. Basic tips for this is really simple. Obviously, we're going to be standing up, but one thing is shift 1 to 2 gears harder and then stand up. There is no need to stand and try and pedal at 90 RPMs standing up. That's that's difficult for even the best riders. And truthfully, if you're, this is kind of a side note, if you're trying to really maintain 90 to 100 RPMs on a very consistent basis, it's kind of a fool's errand. You know, really for most even, you know, recreational and even riders that race, 85 tends to be perfectly adequate, and for many people a lot easier to maintain. But that's a whole nother webinar that we'd have to address that. So so again, shift 1 to 2 gears harder, and I recommend you get up clients that they get up every 10 to 15 minutes. This just, if you get into a schedule of doing it, you know, and every 10 to 15 minutes it is definitely ambitious, but if it reminds you to do it like every 20 to 25, then we're still doing okay. But one thing that can help with this is to set an alarm on your watch, on your computer, your GPS, whatever, and have it go off. And I know it might be annoying to have this thing going off, you know, every 15 minutes. But if you do that, it's going to make remembering it a lot easier. It'll essentially become second nature. You'll start to do it without the alarm. And definitely consistency is the key. I have a lot of clients where I've recommended this to, and then I say, hey, go out every 15 minutes, just stand up, give it 10 pedal strokes, and they go out on a 2-hour ride and they stand up. They remember twice. So that's why I say a lot of times set an alarm, help yourself remember it. So the last, number 5, is what we're going to spend a lot of our time on here, or I should say a little bit more time, and that is that when your handlebar is not in the right place. Your handlebar position, or improper handlebar position, I should say, is the #1 cause of saddle discomfort. And I know that kind of sounds strange. You'd think that saddle position is the #1 problem, but actually handlebar placement is in my experience. Another thing that kind of seems counterintuitive, but our pelvis and our lower body essentially is what determines our optimal bar position. And this will become clear in just a little bit, but when you are stronger, more flexible, more fit, then you can tolerate a longer and lower bar position. And things like hamstrings and spinal flexibility, hip stability, they play enormous roles in saddle comfort, but also in where your handlebar should be placed. And so we're going to get into this in the next 2 frames here in just a minute. But so what happens when your bar reaches off? So let's say your bar is either too long or too low for your body, for your posture. What's going to happen first? You're likely to get numbness, because what happens is the pelvis is going to rock forward onto the soft tissues of the perineum. The perineum is soft tissues where a whole bunch of nerves run down there. So additionally, you're going to get more friction. There's going to be shear force, because you're going to slide forward repetitively on your saddle, just like you would if you tipped the nose of your saddle down, like we talked about on the first frame. The reason this happens is because when we're getting outside of the range where our muscles and joints are most effective, they're going to want to gravitate constantly back to their more effective range. And so that's their only solution is to shorten, in this case, to shorten the reach of the bike. So you can, some people will pull their hands back, but on the handlebars to shorten the reach. But often what happens is a combination of that and also the pelvis sliding forward. And this also goes back to the numbness, because when the pelvis slides forward on the saddle, now the pelvis is resting on the narrower portion of the saddle, and we're in the middle of the saddle where we're not supposed to be bearing weight. And the last thing that happens when we have the bar out of position is we have poor mobility, because we have to understand that normal pelvic and spinal motion disappears, because when we're pushing these joints to not necessarily their limits, but to outside of their comfortable range, and so they can't move freely. So the important thing to understand is our joints, and more specifically our muscles, they tend to work most efficiently, they're most effective in what we would consider the middle of their range of motion. Okay, somewhere in the middle. so we don't even have to get to the end range, but if we just push these muscles, these tissues, these joints outside of that middle, then again, they're going to be really working hard to gravitate back to their, back to their centers, back to their middle. So, and it's what we're doing is when we're working outside of that, it's gonna lock out certain joints and not allow as much movement and not allow normal movement. And this is something I see quite often when I use a 3D saddle pressure measuring device, where we basically put a sleeve on the person's saddle and we can see exactly where they're bearing pressure. And I've had cases where someone is bearing tons of weight through their pubic bone and through the front of the saddle, and all of a sudden we don't touch the saddle at all, but we change the bar position a very small amount, and then they basically, saddle pressure in the middle disappears, and they go back to the back of the saddle and get the pressure on the sit bones where it ought to be. So I'm gonna illustrate this a bit more, and so these next two frames are the same size rider. Okay, so we have the same rider. So there's our saddle. I know, a very rudimentary saddle, but a saddle nonetheless. And we have, for our pelvis, we're just gonna have this triangle. And you can see the pelvis, the triangle, is tipped forward at a reasonably aggressive angle, because let's say this person has good hamstring flexibility, good mobility through their pelvis and through their lumbar spine. That's what this yellow line is to represent the spine. So the spine can flex forward at a pretty healthy angle. From there, we have flexibility through the shoulder girdle, which is essentially the shoulder blade and the glenohumeral joint. But then we just have the reach of the arm. How long are the arms? And then that will help. Basically, that's what determines where our handlebar should be. So right there at the X, boom, that's this longer and lower position is where this particular rider could maintain. He could have, or she could have, their bars down, with this amount of bar drop. But if we go on to take this same size rider, we have their saddle again, but now they're not quite as flexible. Let's say their hamstrings are a bit more restricted, maybe even on just one side. And so the pelvis has to sit a bit more upright, like this representation here. And the spine too, it doesn't have quite as much flexibility. And so it's not able to bend forward quite as far as well. Now the arms are still the same length, but maybe the shoulder blades aren't quite as mobile. We have a little restriction there. And so now arms are still the same length, but now we have a bar drop to there, and we have our handlebar position. That's where that handlebar needs to go for this rider. Even though they're the same size, this bar is actually going to be above the saddle in this case, where with a previous rider, it was way down there. So these individual differences are exceptionally important to remember and to account for when you're setting up your handlebar. So if you do have you're not terribly flexible, or you don't have great trunk strength, or it's something you're working on, or maybe it's early season and you haven't been on your bike a whole bunch, you might need to start with a slightly higher or shorter bar position. So I am going to just briefly, let's see here. There we go. Okay, so I was going to answer just a couple of questions that I had seen popping up here on chat. Just have a few minutes. I don't want to take too much of everybody's time. But so I got a question from a female cyclist, and she's asking, what about gel covers for saddles? And I understand this, the desire to go with a gel saddle or I should say a gel cover for a saddle. But one thing to know is that, softer isn't always better. Actually, in many cases, softer can just mean more friction. And so when I see people come in with a gel cover on their saddle, I'm generally thinking that there's something else wrong with the rest of their fit. There have been cases where, we opt for a saddle that has a little bit more cushioning on it for a particular rider. But in general, if we can often position things properly and not need a tractor seat essentially on there. So yeah, gel covers, I think are often a crutch in that way. So hope that answers your question. The next one, we'll just do one more here. So what's the big deal? Shouldn't riding hurt a little? Well, no, riding shouldn't hurt. I mean, there should be the discomfort you get from the effort, and that's much different than pain or numbness. And incidentally, numbness you should never have, ever, never, ever. That should be something that doesn't occur, whether it's in the saddle or in your hands or otherwise. So we can take that off the table right now. But even discomfort, I think many times there are ways around certain amounts of discomfort. Now, is your obviously you're attached to this saddle, you're touching it a significant portion of the time. Yes, you will feel some pressure there, but it should not turn into pain. It should just remain pressure. And there are instances where we might trade a little bit of discomfort. I would hesitate to say pain, but we might trade discomfort for something else, like in some cases, maybe aerodynamics. Like if I've had a couple of clients doing road time trials, and in some of those cases, they're fairly short races. They're under 30 minutes, maybe sometimes, or the long ones might be an hour for certain age groups. And so it might be worthwhile to get a little uncomfortable in the last 5 to 10 minutes of one of those rides in order to, shed 150 to 200 grams of aerodynamic drag. And so, yeah, so there might be a trade-off there. Now, again, I'm trying to be very careful to stay away from saying pain, because what happens is whenever we do start to, when it kind of goes from mild discomfort to being pretty uncomfortable, and we could call it pain, your body actually goes through a series of basically protective responses, and you'll actually start to see less output. Your amount of motor recruitment in your muscles will decrease, and your power actually will go down. And so it's a really good reason to stay away from pain, because even if you feel like you can fight through it, oftentimes, especially the longer the race, you can't fight the neurological changes in the physiology as far as that goes. So thank you both. Good questions. I'm going to go back to here real briefly. This is our last one here. And I wanted to then just give you a quick review. So one, level your saddle. It's really basic. Again, you might need to lower it slightly. Two, position your cleats. You might try and pull them back just a little bit. That might help to ground you through your feet. Three, least important, do you need a new saddle? That's up for debate. I think I would address all these other things and maybe even a couple more before I start investing in new saddles. And definitely, if you want to try new saddles, demo saddles if at all possible. Number four, stand up. Just get out of the seat for just brief periods even. And five, just make sure that handlebar is in the right position. So if you're having these issues, you might try a little shorter or a little higher position potentially. So that's all I have right now. This is how you can reach me, how you can get a hold of me. My website, where I have a lot of blog posts, is endurancenerd.com. Twitter is @endurancenerd, Facebook endurancenerd, and Instagram, which I like quite a bit actually as well. You can follow me at my name, John Wyrick. So my Fit Studio is on at bicyclestudiogj.com, and there are other contacts there for Twitter and Facebook and all that good stuff that you can follow there. That's about it. Thank you for hanging with me for about 30 minutes here, and good luck with fixing your any problems you've been having. And please, like, comment, subscribe below, and definitely, if you have any questions, you can put them in the comments, and I will try to get to them as soon as I can. I appreciate it. Thanks.